Hi everyone, welcome to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me again this week. Today I'm really excited. I'm joined by Shameema Yousuf. Shameema, how are you? Welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Really nice to be with you today.
It's great to have you on. Now, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. So, Shams, can you tell the world who you are, how you've got to where you are now, and what you're currently doing in the world of sport?
Wow. Okay. Thanks very much. So, I'm a certified mental performance consultant of the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. I do sit on two of their subcommittees, the Diversity and International Relations Committees. I'm a registered counsellor of the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, and also members of the American Psychological Society, Division 47, and British Psychological Society, Division of Sport and Exercise Psychology. So that gives you a bit of insight as to my memberships and certifications. But basically, I have a private practice where 50% of my time I'm working with individuals, athletes across the spectrum from the youth sort of engagement in sport to right up to professionals and elite athletes at the very top end of sport. So that private practice is based out of Southwest London, and that my private practice is empowered to perform. But the other 50% of my time I'm employed by Brighton and Hove Albion Football Club, and I am lead for the women's and girls' psychology program and delivery.
Wow, so you've got a really varied, eclectic sort of form of work right now, and I know you've also got quite an eclectic background. You've worked in the city of London, and if we go back even further, you actually played international hockey. So you've competed at a elite level, and you've also worked within the corporate sector.
Yes, absolutely correct. And I grew up in Southern Africa, and I played hockey out there, and was in the under 21 squad, and played in the elite level there, and then came over to UK, where I progressed in the corporate career here in the financial services industry, and I actually got into commodities trading. And spent 16 years specialized in commodities as a trader, fund manager, and a business consultant. So I do think there are a lot of similarities that can be drawn from that industry in the sort of high performance work that we do as practitioners. And in fact, I often talk about these similarities with some of my athletes. When we're looking at and reflecting on some of the performances that we've had, I sort of liken it to traders who are reflecting on some of the patterns and charts of past trades and looking to sort of take that forward and see how the markets might unfold minute to minute. So as a footballer, for instance, when you're on the pitch, if you have studied and really reflected on some of your past performances and looked at some of the plays, understood where some of the spaces are in the game, it can almost help with your anticipation in future plays, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and I can only but imagine, man, I've never been a trader. I've seen a trading floor, and some look pretty hectic and carnage, and you watch the TV and you look at the pressure and the stress and the anxiety involved in that profession, and I can only but imagine those performance moments on the trading floor must come thick and fast, and the capacity to manage yourself, to express emotion, but to control that expression, to manage yourself under that kind of pressure. Wow, to experience that must stand you in quite good stead, sort of becoming a psychologist and working with sports professionals, particularly footballers, soccer players, because it is similar to me. I find it intriguing. I think that is a really similar landscape.
Yeah, Absolutely. The emotions ride, highs and lows within the financial industry, and you almost have to have that ability to sort of find some space and stand back when things are really letting loose in the markets and things are going crazy. I mean, I lived through the 2008 recession.
Oh, wow.
And experienced the craze of during that time. And it was those who were able to step back, recognize what they were experiencing emotionally, but be able to find some space and breathe it in and take a moment, that were able then to respond in a way that would help them make the right decisions, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's so interesting, Shams, to me, because, again, I know you do a lot of work in football, as you said, at Brighton, Hove, Albion, and with the women's and the girls' team there, also in tennis. The capacity to, I love what you said there, step back, take a minute. Obviously, on the football pitch, tough to take a minute. You might get yourself into trouble there, but just the capacity to take a step back, physically, mentally, take a breath, collect yourself when all around you is going mad. That's such an important skill to be able to build. Do you find quite a lot of that work, sort of the capacity to manage anxiety? Is that a lot of what you do in your role as a sports psychologist or mental skills coach?
Yeah, anxiety is a big one. Talking about being on the football pitch and stepping back, you might not be able to physically do that, as you say, but being able to recognize when your emotions are running high, and to be curious about what is going on, why are these emotions showing up, what's driving those emotions, what is my internal dialogue that's driving that emotion, or is it a situation? And being able to recognize that in the moment, and then really by stepping back, it's a figure of speech, but really being able to breathe through it, recognize it, accept it, and then just apply your attention back in that moment. A very mindful approach, by the way, I use.
Okay, so you say mindful approach. So, I mean, one of the challenges I've always found over the years is that coaches and sometimes even players might say, yeah, but we hear you, Dan, but, that this is such a fast-paced sport. And you can get the same with any invasion team sport. This is so quick, with basketball, with rugby, with all those invasion sports that you can think of. They're very fast-paced. There's very little time to think. But as you allude to, you can experience those emotions and they can impact your performance, they can impact your game. Is it a case of convincing coaches and convincing athletes that they can build the capacity to do that? You mentioned mindfulness. How do you go about doing that, Shams?
So, yeah, mindfulness isn't necessarily sitting down and meditating. It is. I mean, there is that meditation aspect to it, but
sure.
You don't have to employ mindful approaches by sitting and meditating, because that's obviously just not possible when you're on the pitch, on the tennis court, in those fast-moving environments. But in a number of different ways. The breathing aspect, we really need to teach our athletes how to breathe. I find myself constantly having to teach them how to breathe, because a lot of them take this very shallow breath, which doesn't really do anything. So that's one thing I do try and teach all my athletes to do, is to sit down and really take those diaphragmatic breathing and engage in that diaphragmatic breathing. But the mindful techniques, then if we think about it, mindfulness is about recognizing, acknowledging, accepting, and then grounding our attention, refocusing. So if we recognize what's going on, and we recognize that this feeling, this body sensation, how does it show up in our body? Where does it show up with me? That raises our awareness around it. Be curious about what's about this situation that's driving me to this. Then we want to be more accepting of it and sort of say, well, I've seen this before. I know what this is about. Maybe using our breathing techniques. And then some of my athletes find it very useful. For instance, one of my tennis players, her dialogue was that I'm crap. Yep. She would say to herself, I'm crap. And I said, okay, well, let's look at what that crap means. And instead, we came up with an analogy for her, an acronym rather, and we replaced the meaning, or rather than replace, when she started to say the word crap, she realized that actually she's not crap. Of course she's not crap. But she used it as a way to bring herself back into the moment by sort of saying, well, the C stands for concentrate and breathe. The R is about resetting myself with a routine. The A was adjust. You know, I've got a GPS. Okay, so this didn't work for me, but my GPS gives me other routes that I can go down. And the P is the play. Have fun.
The P is the play. Have fun. CRAP. I love that because you're shifting the meaning of something, of a word that usually denotes quite a derogatory term that can be seen quite negatively, shifting the meaning, almost turning it 180 degrees to little practical things that this tennis player can do, and shifting the meaning to something that's quite positive, something forward thinking, something, you know, moving forward towards doing something. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Yeah, it was something that helped her come back into this moment. You know, she had to remind herself to breathe through. It's okay. I can accept that this wasn't a great moment, but that's okay. I can take it forward because I've got options. I've got my routine. I need to just help get my routine together to help me come back into this moment. And then it's reminding herself that she's there to play the game and enjoy it. And we came up with that together, by the way. She had input on that. It was a very collaborative approach.
Yep.
That she related to, and so that was the importance there as well. It's not something that I sort of prescribed to her.
Yeah.
It's something that she came up with herself to sort of be mindful and help her stay in that moment.
You empowered her to come up with her solution, to take control of that, and to drive that. Yes,
that's right, absolutely. And with it's not just with tennis players. I mean, I've had a footballer who used, to ground her attention, used her shin pads as a method to help her refocus in that moment.
A physical cue.
Yes, a physical cue.
And was that to deal with an emotion? It was to deal with anger or frustration, or was it to deal with anxiety? What was that to deal with?
Well, I think it was a host of things, but mainly sort of getting a little bit flustered and a lack of concentration in the moment. So how did she regain her attention and bring it back into this moment?
Is it mental skills, sports psychology? Are these things that you find you have to work hard to sell into athletes, to footballers? Do you feel that landscape is changing? How are you finding the general attitudes out there to this component of the game and of sport?
I think people understand more about mental skills, sports psychology. I don't think there's as much hesitation towards it as there once was. You're seeing the changes within sport organisations as well. But I think it's very much it's more about language and narrative that we use in those environments, and when we're working with our athletes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's about I don't use the word toughness, although I know that there's been a lot of research behind mental toughness, but it's not something I prescribe to personally, because I found that when I use the word toughness, athletes almost feel that they, by showing any emotion or by showing their vulnerability, they're not being tough.
I've stopped using that word. Word, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I think you're right, and actually I think it's absolute banality to suggest that footballers, tennis players aren't mentally tough. For me, they may need to be more mentally skillful. They may need to work on specific techniques to help them be mentally skillful alongside the physical skills that they develop.
Absolutely, and skillful, mentally skillful, mentally agile. I think these are more helpful words. So the language there, I think, is a lot healthier, if I might say. So I think when we use that kind of language, I think it's a little bit more helpful and people are a little bit more open to it.
How do you help a coach become more open to it? Do you find you get much pushback from coaches, or are you finding increasingly coaches being enthusiastic, open-minded, driven to learn the kind of skills that are going to help players become mentally skillful?
Dan, I think I'm very fortunate in some ways. When you have a private practice, often the clients that are coming your way have sought you out.
Of course.
So you're not always having to deal directly with pushback from coaches. And then I'm working at Brighton, Hove Albion Football Club under Hope Powell, and with Amy Merricks, who are, wonderful to work with. They're very open to the support of a psychologist on the team. We work very much as a multidisciplinary team. So again, working with our physio and S&C, we all have input together. And so there again, I think I'm very fortunate in that environment where they value psychology.
You've used this term multidisciplinary. I'm passionate about psychology being integrated into a coaching culture, into a coaching environment, rather than isolated. I think historically, sports psychology, mental skills have been isolated from the main coaching, the core group. It sounds to me like at Brighton, it's integrated. Obviously, there'd be some things you can talk about, and probably some things you can't. But in your experience, how have you striven to integrate sports psychology, mental skills into a coaching environment, into a playing environment?
Yeah, it is very much integrated. I think, first and foremost, it's building that culture of trust, and that culture of trust amongst the staff members. If I suddenly start sort of saying that I can't talk to you about anything, that's not going to allow for that trust to build. So it's doing it in a sensitive way that still respects the confidentiality of the player.
Yep.
But recognizing that there are themes that we can talk about, and there are ways to sort of engage the coaches and the other staff in sort of supporting a culture that allows a player to prosper. So again, I think it really does come back down to the language and the narrative that we use.
You're working with a whole range of athletes, male, female. You're at Brighton working with the women's and the girls' teams. You're building a process throughout the academy into the first team there. Have you found historically that there's many differences between working with males and females?
Yes. Yes, it's interesting you asked that question. Yes, and I think what's become quite clear, or which seems to come up quite a lot for me, is I notice that when I'm working with boys and men, they're far more cognitive and activity driven.
What do you mean by cognitive driven?
They're more about they don't need to express themselves verbally and have a long discussion about it. You'll get a couple of answers, and then it's really let's get on and apply that in an activity.
Okay.
Whereas girls, they are a lot more verbal. They like to relate, and that is really born out of the chemistry of our brains most of the time. We know that there are certain hormones that we are releasing all the time, not to mention oxytocin, estrogen, and the chemistry of our brain relates to the fact that we want to connect with others and relate to others, and we do that through verbal communication. And again, when we look at the neurobiology of the brain, there have been scans that have shown a lot more connectivity to the different hemispheres of the brain in a woman's brain than there are in a man's brain.
Right, so neurologically we're different.
Neurologically we're different. Now that doesn't mean that we should make these generalizations about everyone.
Yeah.
But it can help inform the way you work with certain people. And it certainly has informed the way that I work with some of my female athletes, because I recognize that some of them really do want to talk and they want to have these long chats about things. And even in the training environment, what we notice is that, the girls, they love to bond and form these relationships amongst themselves and have these friendships. They tend and befriend in the sport environment. And at the same time, they're still able to focus on the task that they are trying to complete at that time. If it's warm-up, so during their warm-ups, they'll be asked to do a whole lot of these training stretches and exercises, but at the same time, they're having fun and they're relating to one another. I don't necessarily see that with the boys all the time.
You found that the boys tend to be more task-driven, get on with it, focus on what I'm doing. There's less cohesion, less bonding.
Yes.
And so, for male coaches working in a female environment, a female team, male coaches who possibly want to make it short and snappy and get on with this activity, what advice would you give to them, given what you know about the neurobiology of female athletes and females in general?
What's really interesting is I'm switching between different sports, by the way.
Good.
But this summer I was very present through the grass court season, the tennis grass court season, and I was at the qualifying rounds of Wimbledon and very present during Wimbledon as well. And at the qualifying rounds, I went to the back courts at the Bank of England, where you will often see a lot of the players training and warming up before they go on for their matches. And I sat on the grass for a good half an hour just observing some of the coaches and players on court, and there happened to be this academy coach working with some players. It was a doubles warm-up, and his one player was warming up with her partner, and he started to scream and yell at her because she was having, between points, a good time chatting to her partner and having fun and communicating verbally and having a chat with her tennis partner. And he was having a hard time accepting that this is how women like to compete. This is how they like to engage in sport. And he really would not accept it, and he came up right close in her face and yelled at her. And what I noticed was that it wasn't making a difference. It wasn't helping her. Instead, you could see the anger growing in her, just from the facial expression and her body expression. And so my advice would be is, so long as they engage in the point and engage at the task when they're asked to complete a task, recognize that in their sport environment, women would like to relate to others, like to communicate verbally, and like to form those relationships and bond with others.
And is there any particular communication style, any particular way of communicating that might be different between male and female athletes?
I think male probably are more non-verbal, whereas, again, as I said, they're probably more non-verbal than women. They give you signs or like to maybe write things down a bit more, but I find girls are a little bit more verbal.
Like to write things down. So does that again come back to a sort of a logical versus emotional disparity?
Yeah. So I mean, and that is another thing to sort of mention, is that the emotional biology of our brains is very different. So again, that could be one of the disparities in the biology of the brain.
Yeah, I remember in a consultancy that I had years ago for a national governing body, and the performance director wanted everybody to keep a diary and write everything down, everything that the coaches had said. And it's interesting. I think everybody is different with regard that. Some just don't like to write things down, but what you're saying sort of sparks a memory in terms of a lot of the players in the women's first team. I think more so than the men didn't enjoy writing stuff down, and I don't know if it's a sweeping generalisation, because I'm sure there's plenty of women who like to keep a notebook of instruction and coaching feedback, but I just wonder if that tends to be more of a male thing. I'm not sure.
No, and I think really important to sort of say that, I think the girls, they do reflect and they do like to write things down. But again, I think there is a lot more engagement with their emotions than you'll probably find with some of the guys. Again, I'm always very careful not to generalize too much, but I use that information to help inform my way with certain clients.
I think for a coach, it's just being mindful, isn't it, Shams? It really is. It's just being mindful. If you're a male coach in operating with a female team, if you're a female coach operating with a male team, it's just being mindful that you might not only have individual differences within the team, you might just have to be aware of your own gender biases within the team that you're coaching.
Yeah, I mean, I think as coaches, as practitioners, or anyone that's working with people, we always want to be aware of what our biases are. Absolutely. Is
that something I found myself more and more speaking with coaches about? Cognitive biases, heuristic biases, the biases we bring to the table. We see the world through a certain lens, and our communication, the words we use, the language we use, the instructions we give, the style in which we give instructions, the behaviours we display, tend to be driven by that lens. Do you find within your role that you're doing a lot of observation of coaches and giving feedback and having conversations around those kind of cognitive heuristic biases?
I wouldn't say that I'm having a lot of conversations around those heuristic biases, but I do notice a difference when coaches, for instance, are more open. They ask more questions than they instruct. And I think when they are able to ask and understand why a player has done something that they've done, or why was it that you made that play, or why is it that you're struggling with that, they get better information from that rather than, and it could be their biases, I'm not quite sure, making an instruction and communicating too directly with the individual. They don't really get any feedback from that.
Absolutely. So rather than being overly instructional, overly directive, being more non-directive, asking questions to direct the attention of the athlete, the tennis player, the footballer, towards what they've just done, asking them questions around that. Why have you just done what you've done? What made you make that pass? What made you take that shot on?
And that's part of that instant, in the moment self-reflection, if you like. And by the way, again, in the football environment, I've noticed, I say this again, that I'm very lucky to work with Hove because she comes with a lot of experience. And so, again, noticing her style of questioning and understanding from the players, always when we do analysis with the players, it's always trying to get them to sort of give their thoughts on what they're seeing, rather than the coaches sort of saying, well, this is what we're seeing.
When you say her style of questioning, what do you mean by that?
Well, again, it's leading with questions and asking them to reflect on their own performances rather than prescribing what she's seeing on their performances.
Okay. So helping players be a student of their game.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
Helping them process what they're doing in a deeper manner rather than just instructing that could kind of work at a surface level.
Yes, helping them process the detail of their game. Yeah.
Because that's what I notice about great coaching, and it's interesting. You've been by the side of tennis courts. I've done a little bit of tennis myself, not huge amounts, but that must be very rewarding, just being up close to a tennis coach working with an elite tennis player. And I would imagine it's an environment where great coaching is about asking a lot of questions. Because it's one-on-one, there must be quite a lot of times you can stop the play, you can ask a question, you can help a player reflect on what they've just done, just you sort of dig into their short-term memory, compute why they did what they did, make suggestion, offer choice. It must be quite a rich landscape of diverse coaching approaches.
In that moment, if you're a coach and you ask a player to give you feedback on how did that feel, especially in a tennis, how did that feel? What do you feel went wrong in that forehand swing or in your serve? And you start to ask them to really think about, the feeling, and in that moment, you start to get a lot more from them. And it's helping them to be the instructors of their own game.
Absolutely, because the only people who can actually adjust action, motion, movement is the competitor, the player, him or herself. And so by asking the question, what did you feel? And I assume by feel we're talking kinesthetic. The kinesthetics.
Yes, kinesthetic feeling. So, I didn't feel that, my legs didn't feel close enough together. Okay, So if your legs aren't close enough together, or I felt my legs were a bit straight in that particular point or in that movement. Okay, so what do you need to do then? How do you need to correct that? Or I felt that I came onto the ball too flat. Okay, so how do you need to adjust that? Then you can help and guide in that feedback.
And you're driving attention, aren't you, as well? I mean, it's attention, awareness, intention, they're so related. And
yeah,
we talk about, as sports psychologists, mental skills coaches, we talk about the importance of attention. And it's embedded within the coaching process, isn't it? When you're asking those questions and you're helping a player direct their attention inwardly or outwardly towards their motion or towards the opponent or towards the ball. But if we're talking specifically about technique, maybe we're helping players direct their attention inward towards their motion. You are driving attention, you're driving focus of attention. And that's where coach is psychologist. That is where coach is driving mental skills, would you say?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, our job is to impart some of these skills and some of these techniques, not just to we don't just do that with our players. I mean, we're helping some of the coaches, and some of the coaches, they instinctively know a lot of this stuff themselves. But we can help guide some of that language around it, some of the approaches, so that they can then support their players day in, day out. We're simply there to facilitate that environment.
And I think language, you've used that word language, I think language is so important here because I think there's a great deal of similarity between, to a degree, golf and tennis, individual sports, both quite, dare I say it, technical sports. And when we're talking about the language of executing movement and motion, yes, we want to drive a player's attention, but also using the language of psychology such as confidence. Show me a confident golf swing, show me a confident forehand, show me a confident backhand. I've always found as a sports psychologist I can help a coach, guide a coach, to envelope technical instruction with mindset or mental skill. So if they're driving the attention of a competitor onto their forehand and something specific, their hand movement, their arm action, whatever that might be. But then I always talk to a coach about, well, can you envelope that also within confidence? Show me what a confident forehand looks like within that new motion, within that new hand action. I find that so important.
Yeah, and I think you're looking at it from a coaching perspective, and then if you look at it from the player perspective, is getting them to also recognise that what are some of their key strengths and some of the behaviours behind those confident plays. So one of my players sort of said, when I'm confident on court, when I'm a confident player, my shots are deep. And one of my strengths is really hitting it deep from the forehand with a lot of topspin to the baseline. So getting them to think about what confident play looks like for them, as much as it is helping the coach to direct some of that confidence in the player.
Absolutely. And as you're talking there, it's making me think of the disparity between process and performance and outcome to a degree. The process being the action. So the coach is driving attention there, and involved there is a new, say, hand action with the forearm shot, enveloped in confidence. And the player knows, well, when I'm at my best, my shots go deep, they land deep. So adding that into the mix as well, there's a performance in there as well, and the outcome is, well, it's a winner. It's a strong, firmly hit, hard shot. There's a winner. So I love that, as you say. It's best moments, isn't it? It's strengths, it's best moments, it's point one, and it makes me think of two things: that players don't necessarily reflect on that well enough, and that players are so good at remembering their bad stuff and not their good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, part of my work, especially with all my athletes, is that I really drive home this importance of reflecting on every aspect, and reflecting at the end of a match on some of the things they did really, really well, and even as part of our preparation ahead of a game or a match. What are three skills, three of my strengths, and those being their skills? What are three skills that I have and strengths that I have that I can really think about, that are going to help me, with my confident play in this scenario, and then also not just their skills, but to think about three character strengths. So character strengths might be, well, I persist through adversity. Okay, so, think about an example when you've done that, so that when that situation arises in a match or in a difficult scenario within a game, you can remind yourself that, I'm a persistent player. I've been through this sort of scenario before. These are one of my character strengths, and I'm going to engage this strength in this moment. And that's that sort of positive psychology approach and build and broaden. The more you sort of engage your character strengths, sort of you've got stronger coping mechanisms to call upon, if you like.
Which brings us full circle back to that mindful piece that we spoke about at the beginning of this conversation 40 minutes ago, which is when you recognise that you're distracted or you're suffering a bit of anxiety on court. It's so easy to forget that your strengths are to hit that shot deep, to be aggressive on it, that your character strength is persistence. It's, in neuroscientific terms, I'm aware that it's this idea that the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe, shuts down during that stressful moment. So I find it so important that players, when they walk onto the court or the course or the pitch, that no, they don't want to be engulfed in self-regulation for 5 sets or for 90 minutes, but to have a keen idea that a part of their performance is that they have to self-regulate, they have to manage the anxious moments, and having those character strengths, knowing their game strengths, paying attention to the right things, shifting back to the right things is vital.
Yeah, and let's not forget, I mean, there's time between points, so using those routines to help you slow down between points and to collect yourself, and use those moments to bring to mind some of these things can be very useful. I'm working with a particular player at the moment who really gets very anxious around his serve. So we've really put into place a little routine that he does that reminds him of some of his strengths on his serve, and when it works really well, why it works. But most of all, taking that time and slowing down between points has been critical for him, because what we found was that he was just racing from one point to the next and not using those break between points to sort of collect himself and breathe through it.
You've mentioned character strengths, which is a tool that seems to come up constantly on the Sports Psych show. It's a branch of positive psychology. Do you lend yourself towards positive psychology much? Do you use much in positive psychology? I'd
say constantly with my athletes. I always talk about what are some of their strengths. And, often when you ask that question, what are your strengths, you'll find the response is always related to, well, I've got, I'm a strong defence player, or, I've got good skill on the ball. And I'm like, no. I want to know about some of your character strengths. Tell me something about yourself, and they find it quite hard. They find it quite hard to talk about their strengths, because I think we, as human beings, we tend to always focus on negative aspects about ourselves. So I actually use the VIA survey quite a lot, which is a survey of 100 questions that actually, after taking the survey, allows you to sort of understand what your top strengths are, character strengths are. And then we talk about some of those strengths, and we talk about how they relate to them in their sport environment, as well as in their general life. But we, given that I'm working with them in a sporting context, I like to talk about that. And sometimes compassion comes up, sometimes kindness comes up, sometimes perseverance comes up. So how does compassion relate to a moment in sport? Well, if that's one of your strengths and it's showing up as your second highest strength, well, how can you be more compassionate towards yourself in that moment when something like that happens? And they sort of say, oh, yeah, why am I, I'm really self-critical of myself. I said, yes, I know that, I see that. But look at this, one of your strengths is compassion. And when we have a dialogue around that. So I find the VIA survey really helpful in that respect. And I'm always working with my athletes to try and understand what are some of their key strengths and how do we relate some of those key character strengths, rather, to their approach of competing and performance.
It's interesting, the perception people have of sports psychology tends to be so PST, MST related. So by that I mean psychological skills training, mental skills training related. That's what people think we do all the time. Self-talk, visualization, imagery, etc., etc., goal setting. But it couldn't be further from the truth, could it? Sports psychology is multifaceted, and sports psychologists use different frameworks, different approaches to problem solve in different scenarios. Every single athlete brings different challenges to the table, and as you mentioned earlier, a big part of the consultancy process is co-creating solutions with athletes. Have you found the same thing, that perception tends to be a bit, well, you teach mental skills, whereas in actual fact, we could talk about positive psychology, we can talk about rational emotive behaviour therapy, we're involved with helping players use more rational language. It's very multifaceted, isn't it, sports psychology?
Very much so. And I think you're right. People think sports psychology is all about visualization or building confidence, and it is those things. I'm not saying it isn't those things, but they think it's only those sort of things. I wonder whether that goes back to a traditional model of teaching of sports psychology, which has, I think, evolved since. And I hope it has evolved nonetheless. I know certainly the program where I got my training was very multifaceted and multi-informed, if you like.
Where was that, Shams? Where did you go and what did you do?
I did my training in the USA at Boston University under Amy Balzell. And
was that a deliberate decision to head out to the States for that?
Very, very deliberate. Yeah, I must admit, I had looked at programs here in the UK and looked at other programs in the States, and that particular program drew me, not because, mostly because it was a counselling degree specialising in sport and performance psychology, and it was an applied program, which meant from day one, whatever was classroom-based teaching was taken out to the field and implemented. So under supervision, you were engaging, observing, athletes in their environment, and being side by side with the coaches and your supervisor. So for me, that was very, very useful. And that's what I was looking for, is that experiential learning, if you like. And also because I think it was a holistic approach. And I recently wrote an article about this over the summer during the Wimbledon Championships, about sports psychology not being all about, it's not life coaching, it's not mental skills training. I mean, sports psychology encompasses, it's an umbrella term for, you might draw on things from developmental psychology, from positive psychology, from counselling psychology. You might draw on different approaches to working with an athlete. And I spoke about it because, I worked with, one of my examples was that I'd worked with an athlete competing at Wimbledon one year, who said to me the last thing that she wanted to do was to be on the court at Wimbledon. That's the last place she wanted to be. And there's this tendency for some practitioners to go in and say, well, let me give you some skills to focus when you get on court. And my approach was very much about trying to understand and unpick what was behind all of that. What was going on in that person's life that made her not want to be on court. And as it transpired, she was struggling with a transition in her life. And that particular transition that she was going through, and that those changes that she was going through, called upon me to work from a family systems perspective. So to really work with the family and herself to find a way of helping her to manage that situation so that she could then find enjoyment of being back on court and competing. So it wasn't really just about delivering mental skills there.
There's a human being on the end of the tennis racket.
Absolutely. Human being first, sport second. And yes, I never sort of, I recognize and I always acknowledge that their athletic identity is important to them, sure, but they also have a broader identity, and they are, a human being.
It strikes me that a passion of yours is indeed to help a player perform at their best, but you always have their well-being in mind. It's performance with well-being.
Yeah, very, very much so. I'm always, and I think that's interesting as well, because I think those who've worked with me have noticed that difference in my approach, and the difference that they have seen in me and other practitioners. And I'm not saying that there's no one else there who takes the approach that I do. I'm sure you do, and I know a lot of other practitioners do. But there are some who are very driven in performance mental skills. That really isn't my approach.
So when you have a player in front of you, do you have a series of questions that you might go through, a specific approach you might take to piece together the challenges that they have? Do you have a specific framework that you use to help with well-being and performance?
Yeah, I mean, I call on a number of different assessments, and I have a sports inventory protocol that I use that really just seeks to understand who's the person in front of me, who's in their support system, the people around them that they sort of turn to in difficult moments. What are the things outside of their sport that really interest them, that they like to do? What do they do in their downtime? How do they like to have fun? Really getting to know the person as you would any other person.
How can coaches be involved with that process, Shams? Because I think this is for me, the 21st century coach in any sport is the psychosocial coach. That's my slight bias, my passion in part, aside from competitiveness, is helping coaches become what I call psychosocial coaches, because I think in coaching, when I was a golf coach, in my training and in the training of my golfing colleagues, I'm not saying there wasn't a holistic education, there absolutely was, but you're still very socialised, and I understand why you're still very socialised into the X's and the O's, and in golf, the swing, the technique. And I hear it and I know that's important, and as I always say, denying that is like denying the presence of the sun and the moon and the sky. Of course, coaches need to have a great knowledge of X's and O's and technique. But ultimately, those X's and O's and that technique is impotent without the ability to have a keen grasp on the psychosocial elements of the game and development and human beings and life and communication, etc. So when you work with coaches, and I know you're in a fortunate position whereby you work with a lot of great coaches, who are good at this stuff anyway. But for the audience out there who are predominantly coaches, what kind of things, and some of them, Shams, have very little time to do this, wet Wednesday evening down in southwest London where you're based, what can they do? What can they do to help the well-being side?
I think first and foremost is just engaging in a conversation with the person about how's your day. I mean, it doesn't take much to sort of ask a player or a youngster or even an adult, how's your day today? What did you do? What's going on in your life? And just trying to relate and connect with that person on a basic human level. That's where I'd start. Rather than sort of saying, right, okay, here for training, come on, let's get going, we've got to get going, right, off you go, do your warm-ups. I mean, how are you all? How are you doing? How was your day today? It's really basic relationship building skills. And that's key. That's what I would say. It's the relationship building. Build a relationship with your athlete.
Absolutely. It's challenging though, isn't it, Shams? Because again, I'm thinking about the voluntary sector of sports coaching, which is probably 99%, and I'm thinking of the lack of time, and you've got God knows how many kids there running around with the ball, and as you're talking there, I'm almost thinking of getting them into a little group, and hey, there's some really creative, imaginative coaches out there, but getting them into a little group and sort of saying, okay, hands up who had an 8 out of 10 day today, who had fun today, who had a 7 out of 10, who had a 6. Oh, did anybody have a less than 5 out of 10? Right, everyone, right, we're going to cheer up little Johnny, we're going to cheer little Mary up now, we're going to play a real great game and make sure that they wipe away their bad game. It's like that, isn't it? That's kind of what you've just said, really.
One technique is, like you say, out of 10, where are you at today? And ensuring that everyone has a chance to voice where they are. So you break out into little groups, perhaps, and you sort of say, right, you lead with that question, where are you today? And then someone might say, well, I'm a 7 out of 10. And if you ask them, okay, so you're a 7 out of 10 today, tell me why. Often you'll find that individual will go and tell you why it's not a 10 out of 10. They'll focus on all the negatives, but I won't tell you what's got them to a 7, what all the good things they've done that's got them to a 7.
I think the other interesting area of well-being, I don't know if you found this historically, Shams, is it does have a big relationship with performance, especially at younger age groups, because your coaching environment really influences the thoughts, the feelings, behaviours that the young competitor or young participant. Competitor is the wrong word here. Young participant, the 10, 11, 12-year-old. They're there to have fun, aren't they? And I think too often we're in sporting environments, we're too quick to make it competitive. Dare I use that word because I've just used the word competitive, but make it competitive, and we're too quick to almost professionalise things and structure things, and quite often young people who have had a challenging day at school, who might have certain challenges in life at home, they want to come and kick a ball around, they want to come and whack a tennis ball, they want to come and thrust the golf club in the way of a golf ball or whatever, and send it a million miles out there. And that's well-being, isn't it, Shams? For me, I just think it's so, well-being and performance are so, and participation, they're related, they're part of the same cocktail.
I think you've made some good points there, Dan. If you overstructure things, you lose the interest of the young players. So play, have fun. One coach sort of said to me, when my players come to training, they sort of say to me, it's not fun, we want to have fun. So I sort of said to this coach, okay, well, what was your response? Well, they said, I don't understand how it's not fun for them. We're getting to do really cool drills, and, they get to run around a lot. And I said, well, but that's all fine, but did you ask the question, what does fun look like to you? And he was stumped. He couldn't, he didn't know how to answer that. He said, no, I didn't ask them. Why would I ask them what fun looks like? And I said, well, because they're telling you it's not fun. So what does fun mean to them? So how do you know what to deliver or how to put in place certain things if you don't understand or you don't have their engagement in what fun looks like? So in that respect, it's coming back to how do you plan and set goals? How do you make those sessions fun and engaging? Do you overstructure things so that they actually then feel it's too regimented? Do you hear their voice? Do you allow them to share with you what their thoughts are about certain things, or do you stifle that voice? You're right. It's being creative, keeping them in mind.
Absolutely, letting them drive the fun. What's fun to them? What's their voice? What do those behaviours look like? What do those activities look like? That's so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
So important. Shams, fantastic. So much great information there. And I know there will be people out there who would love to get in contact and love to connect up.
I am on Twitter. Thanks, Stan. At Empowered to Perform. I am also on Facebook with my page, Empower, the word Empower, the digit 2, and then the word Perform. Empowered to Perform. LinkedIn too. So, if those who are on LinkedIn want to connect with me there, that's absolutely fine.
And your website is empoweredtoperformagain.com.
Yes, brilliant. That's right, Dan.
Okay, excellent. Well, look, thank you so much for your time. I know I got lots from that. And if you out there, if you, the audience, enjoyed that, please do leave a rating and a review, and don't forget to subscribe to the Sports Psych Show. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.